Alright everyone, so we are looking here at Amy Tan's section from the Joylet Club, which is called Two Kinds. And Amy Tan, as you read, her parents were Chinese immigrants, and so she grew up in California as a Chinese American woman. And she had a lot of tragedy in her life. Her father and older brother died, and she ended up moving to Switzerland briefly with her mother and younger brother. There's a lot of tragedy in her family, which you heard her briefly talk about in that video that I had you watch as well, where her 20-year-old grandmother ended up being kind of forced into marriage into an 81-year-old man. So it was a lot of interesting things in her life, which really painted images of female bonds and female struggles within the sort of the immigrant Chinese American identity. So that's really what she often talks about. So The Joylet Club is a very famous novel. It's been translated into, I think, 25 different languages. And it talks about this young woman who basically discusses the relationships between Chinese American young girls and their parents who have formed this chess club. Not chess, I'm sorry. Who have formed a bridge club. And they basically it's a coming of age novel that really focuses on how the struggles of growing up with immigrant parents as a first generation American can affect your sense of identity, along with really all the struggles of being a teenager and growing up, period, with parents and different wills and different ideas of what your future might be. So if you, like me, have a parent who is an immigrant, it's something that speaks to a lot of people, and it definitely is a novel that speaks to me a great deal when you have blended cultures and how often those two cultures can cause divide within yourself. So some major themes from this novel are dual identity. So the idea of the divided self, meaning this young girl, our narrator, she basically represents the divided self in the sense that she works so hard to understand what her identity is. She has an identity which her mother is pushing her to be. She has an identity she wants to be. She has an identity that she really is. And then none of these seem to work in cohesion with one another until she finally accepts that she can't be anything but who she really is. Multicultural identity is equally prevalent in this novel, obviously, with the Chinese culture and her mother having come from China. And if you'll notice, the father is very limited in the text, and that's, quite a direct allusion to her own biography, but also because the most prominent feature here is the feature of the mother-daughter connection. The female bonds, like I said, is really significant. We see not just the narrator and her mother, but we also see side characters briefly, like Auntie Lindo and Waverly. So we have female bonds throughout this text. Waverly and our narrator also have a lot of struggle with one another. And then sort of the reality of the immigrant life. In the last text I had you read from Cisneros, we looked at the sort of false dream of the American dream, and that's exactly what Tan is speaking to when she's talking about her mother's identity, her mother's ideals of what she should be versus what she really is. For example, when she talks about the beginning, how all the different kinds of prodigies that her mother's trying to help her find which one she's supposed to be. So she says, at first I could be the Chinese Shirley Temple. So her mother tries to make her into an American white image with the Shirley Temple haircut, and the tap dancing and everything else, and it goes horribly wrong. It doesn't look like this little girl. And every time they try a new one, it's over and over again. She gets more and more frustrated because none of these, American ideals are what she is or who she really can be. Then again, we also have the idea of children versus parents and this discussion of will. And as anyone who's grown up under, a parent or two parents, you understand that there's often a clash of wills when it comes to being a teenager, simply trying to navigate the difficulties of growing up and identity and understanding who you are versus the will of your parents, who often maybe want you to be something that you don't want to be. So the style of this novel is a coming-of-age novel, like I said. It really is it's told from the adult narration perspective, but she's telling it from her sort of childlike experiences, childlike self, and it's a first-person omniscient narration. So we see into the narrator's mind, and we understand exactly what she's feeling and thinking. And she's a storyteller. So Tan is someone who speaks through her narrator by telling stories about different episodes in her life. So she's talking about these different experiences of her mother trying to train her to spout these facts. So she could be on the Ed Sullivan Show, or all these different things, and how they lead to her discovery of who she is. The other characters outside the mother are all secondary. They're really not nearly as important as the mother. She's the central figure here, and the central will which helps shape this little girl. And we do have, like I said, other female characters like Auntie Lindo and Waverly who feature later, but primarily it's the mother. The father is not even mentioned until the very end of this section that I had you read, because again, the female bonds and the female relationships are the primary relationships in this text. So the literary devices that are used are really important. So Tan has a very straightforward narration style, but she uses particular devices to kind of help paint this beautiful imagery in her text. So she has a lot of imagery that's tied directly to objects and cultural references. So we have mentions of specifically American things. She brings up Christ, or not American, but specifically Western ideas. So she brings up Christ, she brings up Cinderella, she brings up Chinatown and California. She, make a lot of cultural references to the era in which she grew up in. So we have discussions of, like I said, the Ed Sullivan Show, Chinese Shirley Temple, Ripley's Believe It or Not, Good Housekeeping, all these things that kind of paint an image of the culture that this young girl grew up in. And it's a culture that many immigrant children have grown up in and understand. So her mother, is an immigrant, and she's got a blue collar job. She cleans houses, and she trades her job for ways to try and help her daughter, because not only does she's not pushing her daughter in the sense that she wants to live through her daughter, but she's pushing her daughter because she wants to give her the quote unquote American dream and give her everything she can. But the daughter is really struggling to see that. She doesn't see it that way, and that's where the tension lies. There's a lot of dialect here that's unique to the Chinese American culture. So the mother's dialogue, as you can see, is ESL dialogue. She brings in some Chinese phrases and Chinese imagery and ideas, and a lot of cultural norms that she references, like Auntie Lindo, for example, are something that is uniquely Chinese. So she kind of unfolds them seamlessly. You almost don't notice these things, but it's the reality, the everyday reality of this little girl's life that's being painted through these little details. And she also has this beautiful descriptive imagery that she uses with these metaphors and quite often similes that she likes to use. So she really has a way of describing something with sort of these beautiful images, like where she's describing how Old Chong teaches her to play the piano. So I kind of want you to notice also how the style unfolds a lot of sort of artistic imagery in it as well. The narration itself is it's relatively informal in the sense that it's not overly formal. She has a beautiful narration style, but it is something that is realistic. You feel as though you're talking to a friend when she's describing these people. She talks about Old Lady Chong, or how she said, I learned that I could be lazy and get away with mistakes, lots of mistakes. It's a very informal, friendly, approachable narration style, which is equally important. She's kind of escaping the formality of her parents' expectations of her. And that brings us to this idea of the divided self. The divided self, again, is key. So there's a lot of divisions within this little girl's identity. And like I said, if you have grown up in a culture that's not your own, if you've grown up with immigrant parents, it is a very real struggle. It's something that we all go through when you have this divided identity. And even if you haven't grown up with immigrant parents, a lot of people have divided identities between what their parents want for them and what they want. Or between the life maybe their parents grew up in and the life they're growing up in. So these divisions are really significant. The division between her mother's image of her future and her own is the most important one. That's what drives the plot itself, where she's describing all the different ways that her mother is trying to make her into this progeny because she thinks that's what she's supposed to be, the next American great singer or piano player or genius or whatever it might be. But she says on page 1123 that after seeing her mother's disappointed face once again and again and again, seeing that she can't measure up to this image, something inside of her begins to die. And she goes to the mirror and she has this moment where she's looking at herself and all she sees is what this ordinary face. She says, such a sad, ugly girl. She starts to almost claw at the mirror because she can't stand the image of herself because it doesn't measure up to what her mother wants her to be. But that moment is also really significant for her because it makes her into who she is. So she says the girl staring back at her, she realizes was angry and powerful. She had new thoughts, willful thoughts, and thoughts filled with lots of won'ts. I won't let her, my mother, change me. I promise myself I won't be what I'm not. And that sets into motion this sort of willful reaction against her mother's ideas of what she should be and how she should act. And really that also speaks to her ideas of being a teenager. And how difficult that is, especially in this kind of situation. And she talks about how these two ideas of cultures don't fit well. So can we go back to, say, the Shirley Temple haircut, where she realizes it looks horrible on her because it's not her hair, it's not her culture, it doesn't work with her beautiful face. It's a different style, and it's not who she is. And so she's constantly having these two cultures clash against one another and seeing how they don't always work. She also has a struggle between her own shortcomings and her strong will. So she wants to at once push back against her mom, but she also wants to be the progeny in her own right. She wants to choose what the progeny is that she becomes. So she wants to choose whether that's a musician or a writer or whatever it might be. But she also really likes to think about becoming that center star, and she calls it foolish pride. And she says that when she has the piano recital, this is when it's really important. She says that, that was the moment that she realized that she failed her mother and she failed her parents. She failed representing them to the rest of the culture. And she also failed herself, and that's what's really important. But she also learned to accept failure. Now, it's really important that also that you go back to this idea of American standards of beauty and success with her own identity. And again, she talks about accepting who she is. She's not going to be, a model. She's not going to be a genius. She says, I didn't get straight A's. I dropped out of college. I didn't go to Stanford. I didn't do all these things that my mother wanted me to do. But I'm still a success because she said, I made my own identity. But the moment that I really want to draw you to is the moment where all this comes to a head is on 1128, when she talks about her mother sitting her down at the piano to force her to practice, and she pushes back enough that she finally almost breaks her mother's heart. And she says, I wasn't going to do anymore. I wasn't her slave. This isn't China, she says. And so the mom sits her down, and she basically says, she starts yelling. She says, you want me to be something I'm not. I'll never be the kind of daughter you want me to be. And she says, mother says there are only two kinds of daughters, those who are obedient and those who follow their own mind. She says, you will be the obedient daughter. And she does something that she knows will wound her mother. And she says, then I don't want to be, I wish I'd never been born, basically. I wish I'd been like all the rest. And we find out that her mother had lost babies in China. We don't know whether that was, government regulated or if it was miscarriage, but we know that there was lost children. And so we see why this little girl is so significant in her mother's eyes, not just because she loves her, but because she's the only one she's had. She's the only one that hasn't died. And so that's really, really important. And she knows this pushes back so hard and breaks her mother's heart. And you can see that as she kind of retreats out of the room, and she says, as if she were blowing away like a small brown leaf, thin, brittle, and lifeless. So that brings us to where her resolution, where she basically brings us back to the present, and we see that she's accepted herself, and she has a moment with her mother. She says she never asked her mom, because her mom offers her the piano when she's an adult, when she's 30. And she says, never asked what had frightened her most. Why had she given up hope on her? Because she says after that moment, her mother never made a practice again. She let her kind of make her own mistakes. And it was a significant moment because it made her who she is. And she says that it surprised her, and she says, "Won't you miss the piano?" And she says, "No, it's always your piano. You're the only one who can play well." She goes, "Well, I'm not very good." She says, "You could have been a genius." She says, "No, I couldn't have." But the mother says, "You could have." She says, "You were just not trying." And she realizes she wasn't angry, she wasn't sad, she wasn't upset with her for not being a genius. She was upset with the fact that she didn't try, that she didn't give it her best effort. That's all her mother ever wanted from her. So she finally sees this her mother offering to give her the piano as the acceptance of her mother, of her own will, and the acceptance of herself. And in the end, we find out that her mother has passed away, and as she's kind of putting all these her mother's things in boxes, she goes over to the piano that she decided to leave in her parents' apartment, and she sits down to play, and she realizes that the notes kind of come surprisingly easy. So maybe her mother had something when she was saying you could have been a genius. But she brings out these two pieces, and she says one is called Pleading Child, and the other one is called Perfectly Contented. And she realized she's become from the pleading child to a perfectly contented adult. And she kind of sees that these two things are not two halves that are divided, but rather they're two halves that are part of one whole, and they make her who she is. And that is, again, the beautiful kind of imagery that Amy Tan uses in Joy Luck Club. So hopefully you enjoyed that. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, move on to your next assignment.